Okay.
All right. Good afternoon. It's 5 o'clock in Michigan and 4 o'clock in Tennessee. I'm Andrew, also known as Sunfrog, and I am in my home on Tennessee, Sacred Gathering Place, Tennessee, Cherokee land here. And I am a lifelong friend of my friend Scott, who wrote Agape and Anarchy in his tag there. And he's with us from Michigan. And this is the debut live stream of Not Ready for Prime Time, a theology, religious studies, activism podcast that he and I have been planning for a year. We finally decided to get off the ground today. Scott is a member of the Society of Friends. He's a Quaker. I'm a ex-Presbyterian pastor, still infatuated and intoxicated by the Jesus story and trying to find my way in occupied territory in the middle of a culture war that has hurt me deeply in my home community. Anyway, so Scott and I guess are going to try to locate our desire to have this conversation a little bit in some of our lineage as in the peace lineage, the nonviolence lineage of Christianity, or the Jesus way, however you want to talk about that. And Scott sent me an essay. I sent him an essay. That's the kind of thing that he and I have been doing back and forth for years. But just a tiny bit of backstory. I met Scott in the streets of the Midtown Corridor neighborhood, the Woodbridge neighborhood in Detroit near Wayne State University near Tiger Stadium. And he and I both were struggling with alcoholism and drug addiction at that time. And we ran a pretty wild ride. And we would meet up at, the induction center in January of 1991. That'd be 31 years ago. We met up at around the early January when Bush Senior, George H.W. Bush, launched the Iraq invasion of 91, not to be confused with George W. Bush's Iraq invasion of 2003. And Scott and I have been in the streets for peace and nonviolence our whole lives. And here we are. I wrote an introduction to his book, The Gospel of the Absurd. And we've collaborated on my fanzine, Ordinary Space, which is now in retirement. And we'll probably start a new fanzine of Christian, anarchist, pacifist thought, as it were. So he's a seminary dropout, but he's hopefully going to go back and get his PhD in theology at Chicago. And he's got a couple of master's degrees, and I've got a master's degree in theology. And we're just going to stir it up because I've been feeling a grumbling in my bones. I don't know about you, Scott, but I've been feeling a fire in my bones these last few weeks. And it's important that we talk about these things. So, and by the way, down on your screen, there is a mute button when you're not talking, if you care, but I'm going to go ahead and mute myself because I'm going to have a sip of my caffeinated beverage. And I don't want that audio to corrupt the podcast here. So welcome to the debut of Not Ready for Prime Time. And I'll tip to my colleague, Scott Miller, and we'll just kind of bounce back and forth. I think in future episodes, we'll have guests on the show. We might even have a spontaneous guest today. If you're listening at home on Facebook and you want to come on the live stream and you have access to Messenger with Scott or myself, you can message us, and we can think of it like a talk show. We might even bring you on the stream. But I'm going to tip to Scott, and let's get this thing grounded. I do have actually after you talk, Scott, I've got a prayer that I found, but I'm going to read it first. It's in a prayer book. I didn't read it yet, so the title enticed me, so I'm going to read it while you're talking, and then I might come back and further consecrate this live stream with a word of prayer. Anyway, Scott, it's all you.
Thanks, Andy. And what up, though, to those of the Detroit diaspora? I'm out. Actually, left the city a while ago, and now I tend to farm and do a little bit of writing. Sometimes I do substance abuse clinical work. Hoping to get back to do my PhD in cultural criticism and Christian ethics. At this point now, though, Andy and I have discussed collaborating on a lot of things because our lives have taken a strikingly similar pattern in a number of ways. And we finally got together over some frustration over what's been occurring with folks that we tend to identify politically as liberals, but also with people in the church and their acquiescence to never-ending war as a solution for responses to fascism. That being said, one of the things I'd like you to draw from this as we go is how Andy and I communicate with the tensions that exist, not just in some of our theology and our commitment to various texts and lines of thought, but also in the differences in our personality, the way we communicate, the way we identify our emotions, because I think some of this should be an example how men learn to deal with their emotions rather than finding solutions to everything, but rather deciding how to be accountable for what's occurring in our lives. I do not know this to be true about Andrew, but I do know it to be true about me is that I get very angry, and I need to learn to stop being angry because that's not a way to express love. Also about the idea of pacifism is I am not a pacifist by nature. I'm committed to Christian pacifism because it's what the cross calls persons of privilege to do. The cross has no sacrificing the lives of others. It is accepting death as a response to doing the right thing. And that's something that I think is missing from our culture, is the ability to not be rewarded for doing the right thing, or doing the right thing on behalf of others only when it's going to produce outcomes that fit nicely with what we believe is already true. And if the cross doesn't challenge, or the gospel doesn't challenge the things that the culture believes to be true, you're not really reading it. You're certainly not experiencing it. So I think some of our discussion is going to, like, what is a spiritual or religious response to the fact of violence, perhaps the fact of tyranny and fascism? And is our response rooted in what we believe to be true about a God or about a Messiah, or is it rooted in what we believe will work best for the world as it is? Because that's not been working very well, at least not as a means of responding to reality of imperial, the fact of imperialism and the fact of wealth and power and control. So if you want to go forward with your prayer, Son Frog, I'd appreciate that. And then I'd appreciate if you maybe get us off on some sort of foot, even if it's the left one, as we go forward.
So this is going to be from the Book of Uncommon Prayer by Brian Doyle, and I picked it up at a monastery on top of a mountain in Big Sur, California, overlooking the Pacific Ocean when I was on a recent pilgrimage to the West Coast. I do like California. I like the Bay Area, particularly feel called to Big Sur, a place where Jack Kerouac, Henry Miller, and other Lawrence Ferlinghetti and others of the Beat lineage went to write and to explore, and at least for Kerouac to get really drunk and be very aware of his alcoholism. Musicians made a whole album about that. And there's this beautiful Carmelite, I was trying to remember the name of their order, this beautiful Carmelite monastery on top of this mountain overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And like a good kind of progressive Catholic monastery, they had this amazing bookstore. And so I picked this up, and this was actually a prayer written for another war maker, and I'm not going to say which one, and I'm going to lift it up for, but it was written for the architect of a previous war in our lifetime, even in our century. And so I'm going to lift it up for Vladimir Putin, for Volodymyr Zelensky, and for Joseph R. Biden Jr. Because I cannot pray, and let us all, if you're in your who's listening to this, and a lot of people are going to probably be listening to this later, the archive version, but why don't you open your heart to your understanding of your God while we do this together? Because I cannot pray grudgingly, ragingly, reluctantly, furiously, confusedly, complicatedly for their shattered souls. What is the point of praying at all? Yes, even them, the men who have murdered thousands. Even them, the men who cackled when they heard of the success of their plans, who cackled at the roasting of small children. I hope, I pray that somehow, somewhere, sometime they wept at their sins. I pray that their energy was dissolved by mercy, cleansed by love, and sent to redeem itself as the engines of insects and birds and tiny fish in clear pools. I pray that we are right and that there is forgiveness bigger than any slime, and that somehow, in ways that I do not understand or even believe, yet with awe and not a little fear, that God has found a chamber in God's heart for even them, even them, even them. And may it be so. Amen. So I think,
Amen, brother.
I think where I want to start is, and I just saw this on my news today, and I'm not a news junkie. I don't read like New York Times every day. I don't have a news consumption ritual. I don't watch PBS every day. I don't listen to NPR every day. I dabble in Democracy Now. I dabble in a whole bunch of other news sources, but it's fairly chaotic in my ADHD way. But I've stepped up my news consumption due to the Russo-Ukrainian war, which I only found out a few months ago actually began in 2014. And this current intensification of this altercation is an amplification of a conflict that's been going on for 8 years. But I saw coming across my feed today, my news feed today, that Russia has pledged to not use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, where a week ago they said they would, or they could, or they might, or they should. And the United States has a first strike posture. Neither Russia nor the United States has denied a first strike posture as a possibility, as a potentiality. They're keeping that bargaining chip on the table. And in a world that is post Hiroshima and post Nagasaki, and in a world where these where the stockpiling of these weapons of mass destruction by various superpowers is a theft of bread from the mouth of children, I consider the possession of a nuclear weapon to be an act of the crucifier and not the crucified, an act of violence against the poor and the hungry in our world. And so I have leaned into the peace tradition of Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said we live in a world where the choice is no longer between violence and nonviolence, but between nonviolence and non-existence. That there seems to be, to me, a fundamental denial or delusion or sort of, avoidance mechanism going on with the commentariat, with the military brass, where folks are just talking about this thing like a video game, like a game of Risk. And I've always felt this, Scott. I don't know if you've always felt this, but I've always felt this when they start talking, and by they I mean the State Department and and the think tanks and the professional commentators, when they start talking about this stuff, I don't recognize my common humanity. I just said a prayer trying to recognize my common humanity with these folks. But when they start blathering on in their jargon, and you and I are guilty of jargon because we're academic theologians, but when they start babbling in their jargon about the war, I think they're ignoring the fundamental immorality of the entire thing. And there seems to be an attempt to villainize and to otherize the Russians and Putin in this way that feels very vulgar, feels very 1985, day after tomorrow, Cold War rhetoric. And they're not the godless commies anymore. They have the partnership with the Orthodox Church of Russia. They have a patriarch guy, justifying the war as a holy war. And so I feel this kind of human dread. And you and I talked when Scott and I've been typing messages and having phone calls these last week or so. You mentioned to me that you discerned in me a lot of anxiety. And I don't know how I feel about this today, but allegedly John Calvin, and I come out of a Calvinist lineage, and I don't consider myself a Calvinist today, but John Calvin once said that anxiety is a form of praise. And I think what he meant by that is that it's an acknowledgement that I'm not in control. And so I come to this with this, and you talked a lot about us being men, and my pronouns are he and him. I live in a male body and I identify as a man. This vulgarity of this pornographic vulgarity of the entire construct of modern or postmodern war is just, and I find myself just kind of like emoting spiritual vomit, and I couldn't write, an Isaiah, Amos, Malachi, Jeremiah type poem with enough invective to convey how or it would be a punk rock, MDC, Dead Kennedys kind of screamo, rant. Like I don't have invective enough to express my utter disgust with the whole prospect of this particular war, especially having now in the last, month and a half studied quite a bit about the background and the underlying circumstances of this war. So I reached out to you, but it's been a mutual reach because I wanted to talk to somebody else who, one, loved Jesus, and two, didn't want to co-sign the blue and gold flag. I've got people flying the blue and gold flag that would never fly an American flag. I don't understand flags like that. It doesn't make any sense to me. I'm just befuddled by the whole thing, Scott.
The first thing that struck me, and it came from the prayer that you prayed, is the question of what is the point of praying at all? As though first that prayers must be answered. That's one of those fundamentalist or evangelical fallacies. A deity doesn't have to do anything. Certainly a deity is not held to meet our expectations. But then there is something that it's a little humbling when we look to when Jesus is asked by the disciples how to pray. The indication is that, right, the disciples pray for God's will. And there's this difficult part of thinking in terms of whatever we believe to be perfect or perfection in terms of the divine is not going to translate. And then in fact, the divine perfection may be a frightening, if not terroristic thing, if we were to grasp it. If there's a natural order created in terms of peacemaking or nonviolence, Andrew, it's not apparent in the order of a created world. There's no indication anywhere that human beings are not part of creation for absolutely no reason, and that an ordered world is by nature self-destructive. So the question becomes, should I have fear and anxiety about wars turning nuclear? I'm not sure that's a new thing. I'm sure that we all felt safe because we thought there were reasonable people in office for a while. But reasonable people fought the first two world wars, Andrew. Reasonable people fought the American Civil War instead of just freeing up slaves. And there have been people who, marched for peace all along So the violence is going to occur because that seems to be a part of the domination system that orders the world. My question is, so is it a delusion for people of faith to believe that they fit into this by redirecting the world away from something that it is designed towards? What is our role? I mean, the question is, how am I accountable to nonviolence? How do I eschew privilege? And then, right, once I've been able to do that, how do I open that alternative to others so that they do not have to experience the domination system on its own terms, but on their terms? And what that feels like is stepping away from rescuing the world. But salvation is being rescued from the anger and need for power and control that drives you. If we look at Jesus, salvation is getting your needs met when they could not be met before. Right? The empire takes everything you have to prepare for war and continue with war. At some point, they incorporate your gods and whatever limited wealthy class you have into their paradigm, so that now everyone is against you if you're not part of the ruling class. And so being, liberation or salvation is not going to heaven. It's not preventing whatever God allows to happen to the world that will occur. It's telling the truth on the gospel terms, which is, if this is where people are hell-bent on going, how do we offer people an alternative to that? So the anxiety is focused on nuclear weaponry because we can articulate opposition to that. And I'm not suggesting that should not continue. But the role of us all is to work through an alternative where we invite people to leave the domination system and join community regardless of who they are. If they cannot accept the terms of peace, they're free to go back to the domination system. They're free to come back and forth. The question is, what do we do? If we want something to end, is that the rationality we're working under? Because the real question is, what actually is going to replace it? The end of an era could be coming. The end of, as far as we know, the end of tyranny in this age could be coming, just to repeat itself again. That's been revealed to the church. What the church does is take what's been revealed, that the end times means a new time is beginning, and that's another opportunity to explore, experience, and define the kingdom of God for others who may wish an alternative. So I don't know if that's a good response to you.
So when we talk about reconciliation and we talk about loving our enemies, I find myself compelled to lay down some of my ideological, boundary markers and to fellowship with people who I might not otherwise fellowship. I've found this in the 12-step community, and I find this living in rural Tennessee. You find this living in rural Michigan. Scott, just in case everybody's on the same page or just joined us, Scott's up in Michigan. I'm in Tennessee. This is a new theology podcast we're doing. You're listening to the first episode of Not Ready for Primetime. And he's using a terminology called the domination system. And I just want to clarify the vocabulary word. That's a kind of a paradigm shifting word that our evangelical friends grew up calling the world. They called it the world. They called it, the fallen life under the fall. There's many different ways, but it comes out of Walter Wink, William Stringfellow, Bill Wiley Kellerman. It comes out of the New Testament and Paul, where we're talking about the powers and the principalities. And at least as far as Wink and Stringfellow and Kellerman talk about it, the principalities are these embodied systemic evils. And so the systemic evil is not this abstract sort of dead structure that only exists on paper, but it becomes this demonic force, and this almost incarnated demonic force. When they talked about several years ago, why are corporations people? And I feel like in legal, hermeneutic. So like, I think part of what was going on with that was this acknowledgement that the system has a life of its own. And I think in my desire for reconciliation and my desire to avoid violence, I have brokered in my life on many occasions, as have you, but me on a different path than you, some kind of accommodation of the domination system, because living in privilege in post-modernity in America, we have Netflix and grocery stores and high-speed internet and live music, and we have these treats, these tasty, succulent little morsels of narcotic, whatever that might be. It's not drugs and alcohol for you and me anymore, but it could have been,
sugar
Netflix.
and books.
So I think when the Nazarene talks about liberation and salvation from this domination system being a prerogative of the poor and the dispossessed, and we can find this in the Beatitudes in Matthew 25 and many other places in the text, I don't think that it looks like Netflix and chill. I don't think that it looks like a paycheck. And I don't know. I think that we, as white cishet people with an education, we can get into this zone of accommodation, and we buy the T-shirt, we sip a little bit from that, that tap over there, which is not the poison water from Flint that you guys are dealing with, but it's this, Whole Foods water, that's been ultra purified and shipped from overseas. And, how's it go? We hunger for things that do not satisfy. We're getting our protein from the wrong source sometimes, our theological protein from the wrong source. And so I think one of the reasons why most Christians in America don't take seriously or even tender the notion of what Merton and Dorothy Day and Martin Luther King Jr. and now, Reverend Barber and some of these folks would be talking about, they don't tally in that, because it's not, it doesn't apply to them. It doesn't satisfy. There's no payday. Now, there are some folks in our African-American church tradition who preach Black liberation theology. I listened to a pretty darn good sermon by Otis Moss III from the Trinity United Church of Christ on the south side of Chicago the other day. And he was in at least a conversation partner with the kinds of things that we're interested in. But I don't think people want to break up with the domination system. And if the war economy is one of the tickets that we need to punch, I think people make that bargain. But I don't think that's the same for the people who are organizing, unions in like Amazon and Starbucks. And I think people that are ground up in the low wage economy, I think they're becoming excruciatingly conscientiously aware of this kind of Babylonian bargain. And I think it's a curse of, at least it's my curse as a middle class academic, that I continually mistake reconciliation for accommodation. But war is one of those moments, one of those events, to use who's the guy that talks about the event? And I don't know if that's Caputo or whoever, but it's one of these like kind of events of reckoning, encounters of reckoning with my God, where I can't play anymore. I don't want to go get a bunch of poker chips. I don't want to pony up to the table. I don't want to ante up. Like I want, I feel I've got a friend in Nashville who's a poor, lives in voluntary poverty his whole life because he doesn't want to pay taxes to war. Like he's never earned enough money to where he had to pay taxes his whole life. And he's like my mom's age. He's like in his 80s, and he's like, I don't think he's ever paid taxes ever his whole life because he's a Catholic worker, and that's what he doesn't pay taxes.
Well, see, there's an important point there because he's a Catholic worker, and that goes back to the point is the difficulty is deciding how to engage the economy and how to overcome the fact of a place like Whole Foods down on Woodward, or just off Woodward, I guess it was. The gentrification of older neighborhoods, the constant co-opting of good intentions, whether it's organically grown anything, which is certificate, or free range chickens, or the thing that disturbs me is, again, we're not allowing room for judgment. There are people who will just decide to follow along with the Laotian error, right? Okay, Laodicea, you're lukewarm. Your trust is in riches. Well, we're the empire. This is the church in the empire. All along the time, Andrew, there have been dissenting voices in the church to the point where crusades have been launched by the Pope within the boundaries of European states to stop these dissenting churches. Some who just wanted to print the text in their own languages. Others who wanted the right to baptize. Others who wanted the right for clergy to marry. So there have always been dissenting voices inside this monolithic church that after the Reformation became this monolithic church and state model, even in the states which tried to avoid that. And the church, because of economics, has been so tied up in asserting the morality of the nation state, while all the time pushing for it to be more moral, it gets further away from any ability to enact or embody judgment when the state does the wrong thing. That may have ended before the revolution, friend, right? I don't know if that's ever been an occurrence in the United States where the state has not deliberately supported the government in its in any active militarism it's undertaken. So the question is, what do dissenting groups do now, and how do we begin going into Samaria? How do we, and circles beyond? How do we begin preaching outside of churches like Minister and Brother Malcolm X did? Remember when he saw, through his perspective, African Americans leaving a Christian church, and he would ask them how they could go to church and worship a white master after all the white master's done. And I think that we need to engage people, as difficult as it is, the same as protesting against nuclear war, with the same fervor and truth as protesting what the church is doing to accommodate those who make those decisions. How can you make a decision to launch a nuclear missile if you are part of a confessing church? And all I'm waiting is for the confessing church or a confessing church to articulate what it means to come from a position of power and privilege and view the gospel through that perspective, because they've not done that. They've only said, what if everyone else did that? Pastoral care is not allowing people to be true to the gospel. Pastoral care is helping them with sickness and illness. Well, that happens to everyone. The fear of war is just another opportunity for the church to begin anew. And I understand the threat of nuclear war, but there's nothing in the scripture that tells us to prepare for the end of the world. It only tells us to prepare for the coming age, and that's eschatology. We're lacking an eschatological understanding that there's no plan in the text, in Jesus's or Paul's mind, about the end of the world, only the end of the domination of Rome. So something is failing now. It's
Well,
the end of an age here in the States. But what is ending?
Stringfellow said in Aliens, Christians are aliens in another land. I can never remember exactly the way that he says the title, but that this is Babylon, and everybody walking around here thinks it's Jerusalem. And as long as the the American evangelical nationalist white supremacist church thinks it's Zion or Jerusalem or the Holy of the Holies or the anointed city on a hill or whatever, and I bless Joseph R. Biden Jr.'s heart, but his speech on Saturday scared the bazonkas out of me, and I'm going up here on Twitter, and people are like, it's the greatest speech an American president has ever given.
Right, only because it's not Trump.
But at the end of his speech, he amplifies this democracy is the light of the world,
Mm-hmm.
and I think Caesar Trump was a problem. I think Caesar Biden is a problem. I think Caesar Zelensky is a problem. I think Caesar Putin. I mean, I think you and I seek somewhat convivially on this, Scott, is that these Caesars are not, and here's the thing, is I've yet to see a thorough, outside of these renegade Catholic worker Quaker contexts, I've yet to see anybody sort of like reckon with the magnitude of our idolatry, and the way that the left and the right have kind of
they don't read the text, Andrew.
There's like a mini domination. There's like a mini domination system, like that's genetically in like Tucker Carlson, right? But then there's another mini domination system that's like somehow in Rachel Maddow, and they've created these competing narratives of this alleged great cultural chasm like we've never seen,
and thus your anxiety because you're getting
because then all of a sudden you're
opening your emotions to the being directed by people who sell war for entertainment.
Yes, I do. I'm fully.
There's something important here that
I confess.
This is what I mean about attention to the text and being honest about what the text says when we engage others. If you want to call this New Jerusalem and Canaan, fine. You kick motherfuckers out, okay? You took their food. You got your promised land. Tell me what happened to Jerusalem. Tell me, brother, what happened to Jerusalem. Tell me why there's only Judea and not the other 10 tribes. Tell me some of that. And when you say that this is the promised land, right? Well, you had your slaves. Guess who gets to leave with all your shit? If you read the text, it's the slaves who get blessed and liberated. You are unwilling not only to not be at servant status, but you treat your slaves worse than anything that was ever mentioned in the text. And yes, the text supports slavery. How do you come to terms with that? Liberals can't do that. But all these things you mentioned, when you read the text, there is punishment for the chosen or the elect because they are unfaithful to the very poor and marginalized that you talk about. And it states that directly. Jesus is king, Caesar is not.
We actually have a listener, Scott, and he writes, Biden was reacting to being perceived as weak. Plus, it is midterms. Political power perceptions and security theater. And I know this kind,
I agree.
I know this kind gentleman from my community, and I don't know if he shares any of our religious obsessions or proclivities or not. But I think this idea that there's a stage on which toxic masculinity writ large has to be performed to outmaneuver your opponent, because I guess in a sense you're not only jousting with Putin or who's the guy who's over China. I can't say, you're not only jousting with North Korea, China, and Russia. I guess that's your new axis of evil, America. So you're not only jousting with China, Russia, and North Korea, you're also dealing with the internal mechanism. And you and I talked about that, Scott. Maybe you could talk about that for a minute, because you had a theory about why there was such a almost knee-jerk war fever among progressives to support this war and to wave the red and gold blue and gold flags of Ukraine. And let me just say, I mean, this should go without saying, but this is a tragedy. This is a human tragedy, and I have nothing but utmost sense of sympathy and empathy for all civilians who living in the Ukraine, and for all the people living in Russia who have been protesting and going to jail against this war. But what about this idea that you shared with me the other day, that there's some kind of current obsession with the 45th president that's driving people's fever? I feel it's a fever. I feel like there's
your friend. I believe that the friend who commented is correct. I don't think the Democrats could have asked for another war at a better time, because they can say he got him out of Afghanistan, right? And then somebody will say endless war, endless war. Well, there's always another Hitler, Andrew, right? So, I mean, they got rid of Hussein, they got rid of bin Laden, and then things are just kind of moving along, because you can never find a good way out of a war. But there's always another one waiting. And the thing is that this provides not just the world, but a lot of those voters that they say might be uncertain. It's like, listen, who would you rather have in this situation? And if W could have got reelected to a second term, because of an ongoing wartime, presidents generally get reelected, especially if folks think that they're just able to manage things, right? What would the alternative be of switching policy at this very point? And a lot of the middle is worried enough about Putin that they would rather have Biden, not because he's Biden, but because he listens to advisors. Do you think those advisors are peaceniks? Do you think that there's military or economic advisors that doesn't see something good in Russia having to open its economy on the terms of the West, but not allow it to be part of the West? Because Russia's never lived up to the standards of the West. They're the white drunk in the gutter, drinking too much vodka and being pissed on by the rest of Europe. And Biden has always understood these politics. And Biden having a potential war to fight with the Russians is much more attractive to Democrats getting out and voting in big numbers than a Biden without anything, which is basically, I mean, he's not defended us from tyranny here, nor has the Justice Department, right? How many more African Americans need to go out in the streets and get killed before white people start feeling guilty like they did in the 60s? Because they damn sure ain't going to do nothing. They'll vote for Trump again. Right. The reality of democracy is somehow a shining light has never been true for most of the people in the world.
All of the summer of 2020, like glimmers of hope around incarceration and redirecting police budgets to humanitarian. They have the Cahoots program in one city out west where they, instead of a cop, they send a social worker. All that kind of stuff has really kind of just been thrown down the wayside. New York City elected a very hawkish mayor who is just amplifying police.
But we sure got us another endless war, didn't we? Even if we get to watch on the outside for a while, we always get drawn. Churchill said, America always does the right thing, that you just got to wait for them to get around to it.
Well, they've this January 6th thing, it just continually, there's so much salacious, meat for the commentariat right now. I mean, it's just, they just have an endless supply of, just juicy morsels on which to feast. Are you seeing one of the other reasons why I reached out to you to do this, and I'm glad we're finally doing it, and I think we definitely need to start thinking about scheduling some guests that we could bring on to just kind of spice it up a little bit. But I'm not seeing, and I'm gauging this on, scrolling, the websites and podcasts and social media. I'm not seeing yet too much coming out from what I would see is this, Fellowship of Reconciliation, War Resisters League, Quaker, Catholic Worker, Mennonite, the peace side of some of the other mainline denominations. I don't have a sense of a coherent, nonviolent peace movement emerging. And I'm going to write a poem. I haven't wrote it yet about how I'm not going to any more peace rallies because I've been very troubled that some things that are calling themselves peace rallies are really, just rallies for the Ukrainian resistance. And I want to make sure I'm clear in my words. I am not, in any way saying that this is, the civilians of Ukraine's fault. I think there's political factors coming from the greater West, coming from NATO and the United States that definitely egged this thing on or exacerbated this thing. And I do, subscribe to the fairly mainstream view that the dictator of Russia is kind of a rogue aspect, and that it is an authoritarian, country. But this idea of like a pure, good versus evil, I'm not buying it, and I'm also not buying, that it doesn't seem totally clear to me what their objectives are. I don't, almost every day they're like, there's going to be another peace talk today.
Right. Well,
but
right now
they're not telling us one more thing, Scott, and then you can go. They're not telling us in these blurbs even what the goals and objectives are, or what the key negotiations really are in these peace meetings. They seem to want to deny the public access to a vision of what it would take for peace, and instead they want to bombard us with horrific, traumatizing war imagery to elicit sympathies, I think, for heightened engagement. If heightened engagement will come, we will have been so emotionally manipulated by some of the tragedy for the civilians in Ukraine that we would be willing to send troops. And a lot of the sideline cheerleader stuff I'm seeing, from our fellow podcasting armchair, whatevers, are people who do not have children or spouses or cousins on the ground in this thing. And I'm thinking, man, there's a lot of people reaching for, these kind of like game of risk military history takes on this thing. And I'm like, these aren't your family members that we're talking about here, that you're moving around on your little game board. I'm sorry, you wanted to talk and I couldn't stop.
I believe that part of the problem articulated as like just kind of as bare as I can do it is that in our culture we have a need to win, and we have a need to use power and control in order to make the right thing happen, as though good needs us to coerce the terms of which it is received. And that's not the cross. And theologically, I think we can do a lot about discussing the angst we feel over the failure of everyone to recognize the value of peace, but I don't know right now if there's any value to peace in the Ukraine. That's not our call. If we were there, it would be our call. And I think I wrote, if you are practicing nonviolence or call yourself a pacifist, if you're doing so without sacrificing your privilege or your own well-being and still arguing terms regarding the Ukraine conflict or war, that's what leads to John Brown and Bonhoeffer and whoever decides to toss a grenade in this one or attempt to, right? The pacifist goal should not be to talk others out of violence, though that may be a good thing we can do. The goal of Christian pacifism is to use the way of the cross to develop relationship with those who are suffering and in need, whether they are civilian or military. The question of a pacifist response to Ukraine or anywhere else is just kind of irrelevant, unless you're on the ground there. The question is whether we're benefiting from endless war. And if we continue, and you can't just end it, I don't think I can, but how do we incrementally work towards bringing an economy to its knees so that we can begin to restructure relationships on human worth and not getting laid or getting a new vehicle or building a new subdivision? And these are things that may never show up, but right, it's another waiting for Godot. Right, this is all done in faith, and faith means that you may not see the results. You only anticipate vindication. I'm not going to be vindicated for protesting for peace or showing a Ukrainian flag and whatever it is on my Facebook, because no matter how much I want peace, it's not going to happen on my terms. And am I being accountable for the way I benefit from the lack of peace in Ukraine? Politically, I might benefit. Economically, I might benefit. There are all sorts of ways that Americans benefit from endless war that they're unwilling to give up, yet they continue to say they're sick of it. Even conservatives are saying they're sick of endless war, so much to the point where the worst of them are in bed with Putin. This Tucker Carlson guy I've never seen. I just don't watch those things, but I quoted him in my book, not knowing who he was, because he was such an example of what has become of the church in the United States. And the church in the United States has benefited from war. It has been in bed with the war machine. And without the church giving a response, the church deserves to die with the sword, just as this nation state always has.
I've been corresponding with Yuri. I don't believe that Yuri is religious. He lives in Kyiv and he's in his apartment and he can't leave the country because of the conscription order. But I don't believe he's actually been conscripted. I think he's hiding out in his apartment, and he's been making several international media appearances, and he has not been arrested for that by Ukraine. So they are affording him some free speech. Now, they might not know about him. He might be flying under the radar, but he's been releasing YouTube videos and talking on Democracy Now! Several times. And I asked him several questions, and I'm just going to read you a couple of the things that he said. He said, merchants of death and populists are corrupting society. He said that the Azov battalion, which is the neo-Nazi group within the Ukraine military, he said Azov is part of the problem, but the bigger problem is that it has become normal to see our society as a monolith imposing so-called sovereignty. So I think he might have some anarchist tendencies when he's questioning this whole idol of sovereignty. He says, I agree that Biden is one of those who ran warmongering project in Ukraine, and it was a hypocrite to call to fight corruption while corrupting society in favor of militarism. So he doesn't believe that they've overcome the corruption in Ukraine, which there was a lot of the same kind of oligarch. There's a lot of the kind of oligarchopoly that you see in Russia. You also have in that. He also says this of the president. He said he was a popular comedian. He made a lot of great promises, became very, very powerful, populist like Putin. Today, answering questions of Russian journalists, he said that Ukraine has no nuclear bacterial weapons, but he would like to have them, just like Putin. And basically, this guy who lives in Kyiv thinks Zelensky's just another tough guy who never thinks of the consequences. And I want to share one more thing from a guy writing on the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship blog. And this is a group that I've dabbled with. He said nonviolence is the only thing that will ultimately save Ukraine, nonviolent resistance. He said, I believe there's much more nonviolent resistance happening than we hear about. And the corporate media loves to beat the drums of war. So they've reported even just a little on the nonviolent resistance. He says here that he would imagine let me see if I can find this place. It was so beautiful. Yeah. He said, what if they had rallied themselves to welcome the Russians with open arms, feed them, provide them with medical care, allow them to use their phones, and say, welcome to Ukraine. We are not Russia. We wish you no ill will. If they would have been able to completely defend their country nonviolently, that might be utopian. The guy who wrote this piece is an American pacifist who's been a pacifist his whole life, and his name is Bill Galvin. But I do recall the ending of Starhawk's novel, The Fifth Sacred Thing, where a community in a fictional book uses nonviolent tactics to resist an invading army. So I just wanted to put that out there. I agreed with what you were saying, Scott. I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. That's not up to you and me. But I did want to throw some things out there that people are actually saying, well, what if, you know, they were nonviolent on the ground?
And I appreciate that. And we do have models in a lot of places. The Muslim communities in Eastern Europe during World War II who took people who were escaping the Holocaust. And I have a great ethicist to suggest to people, Philip Haley, who wrote a book called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. He wrote a good article as well, but it's based on his experience with Huguenots in France, who Lest Innocent is La Chambronne was the little mountain town. Nazis actually came, and they actively engaged in hiding and helping Friends Service Committee and others lead persecuted Jews and others out of France, where many of the leaders in France were trying to be more anti-Semitic than the Nazis even. It was a dangerous place. And so there is this concept, again, it's often, what if everyone did this? And I think that's a good question. It's easy to answer. If everyone did that, things would turn out a lot better. Do we trust people thinking in what are considered to be rational ways to do that? If not, what is the role of people of faith? And I think your friend and Philip Haley and the pastor of the French Huguenots down there in the book all had the answer. We are a people of peace, and we welcome all those who come. There are things that our faith instruct that we cannot do. And so in this little village, they could not fly the Nazi flag. They would not fly the Vichy flag. They'd not fly any flags. They'd welcome everyone into their house. So when Nazis came, Nazis were offered, soldiers, food, tea, whatever. They didn't have much, but they were willing to share. And that is the ethic of the cross. That is loving your enemies. It's not always honest, because you can't tell someone a Jew's hiding behind a closet. Okay? But indeed, you can love enemies by showing them they do not have to fight, that they can drop their sword, and then they're asked to bear their cross. They may refuse that, as is their right. So there are examples, Andrew, of what you and the person communicating are talking about. It's not been at a national level. It has been at a sectarian level. Can we trust a sectarian ethic to open itself to criticisms, redirection, and most importantly, to reinterpret its authoritative text so that it can continue to act in love of neighbor and enemy, just in different ways than the other communities have? Okay, the church refuses to update and change, and youth are no longer interested in communities of faith. If they are, they're certainly not Jesus communities. But this is what the Catholic workers have always done. So what comes in place of the Catholic worker communities? But we need to have something that welcomes the enemies, but we do it on the terms of the Messiah, trusting that if it doesn't end well, our life is well spent, because there are plenty of things worth living and dying for. Jesus tells us there is nothing worth killing for.
That's a perfect place to end. We're at exactly an hour. You have successfully made it through the debut episode of Not Ready for Prime Time. I'm Andrew Smith, or Sunfrog, from Tennessee. Scott has joined us from Western Michigan. Scott, since I opened up with a little prayer, why don't you close us in prayer, and then we'll do this. If you're free, let's do it next week, and let's get this. I feel like we barely started what we want to talk about, and we'll message over the week about who we might bring on as a guest next week. I am going to New York City, and everybody's welcome to watch it on live stream this Saturday. They're having the 55th anniversary of the Beyond Vietnam speech from the Riverside Church. And some people will be in person at the Riverside Church, which I will be at. And some people will be watching it online. And so I'm eager to see what the Bernice King and Shane Claiborne and Liz Theo Harris and some of the others gathering at Riverside have to say about the peace tradition that King is a part of. So I might have something I might bring back from that, but we'll be talking. Hopefully we'll have a guest maybe next week for at least part of it. And an hour flew by. So we'll have lots more to talk about next week. I'm Andrew. Scott's going to take us out with a word, and then we'll sign off the live stream, and we'll see you all hopefully again. Peace.
Thanks, Andrew.
Peace be with you. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, I'd like to invite all to think of who are your people, who are you, and what ought you do. And I was born into the right kind of people who did the right kind of things until it came time to defend what they had, and they did the wrong things. I became the wrong kind of people. I treated people with utter disregard because they were persons of authority, and I cared not for myself, only to meet my needs and desires. I never cared for another until I was in a gutter. Until I was not only the wrong kind of person, but I didn't like myself and the kind of person I was. I no longer knew who I was. I no longer knew what I ought to do. And then when the time came that I could change, I did. And it was only because I had to continue to be the wrong kind of person. And the person that tells us what they believe to be the truth when it's not what people want to hear. The person who had to accept consequences for doing the right thing, and the person who had to say they were sorry and accept it when other people would not. In other words, sometimes privilege is just taken from us, and that's the only time that we can see what the cross is. And it's only through bearing the cross that we can be faithful. And it's only through some sort of faithfulness, whether we do the right thing or the wrong thing, that we're liberated from doing those things that others expect us to do, liberated from our own failure to meet our own expectations, and liberated from the demands of the world that have always to us just seemed somewhat of a heavy burden. Election is a burden. So if you believe that America or you are part of a people that are part of God's chosen, this is not a privilege, this is a burden. And that burden is the cross. And that's not a pleasant place to be unless you can experience joy amidst a hopelessness of maybe not having your needs met the way you want them met. And I think that was the path that Jesus took as people followed him. If we're going to meet our needs, we will meet them and not Caesar. And that means that things will be a lot harder. And those who do not like each other better fucking learn to get along. Thank you, Andrew. I'll see you next week. Peace.
Peace.